Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
One of the most contested issues being negotiated at the COP26 in Glasgow is to do with climate finance, which essentially involves funds that would help developing countries cope with climate change. Climate finance has been a topic of debate for years, but it takes on a particular significance this year because the COP26, which comes to an end on the 12th of November, is where matters relating to a new climate finance goal under the Paris Agreement will be settled. This new goal will define how money will be mobilized to developing countries post-2025. These countries need the funds for two reasons: to reduce or remove emissions from the atmosphere, called climate mitigation, and to adapt to climate change, called adaptation. Discussions have been anything but straightforward since developed countries have failed to deliver on their past promises of raising climate finance. As climate change worsens, costs of preventing and coping with climate change will only mount, and so developing countries have argued that the corpus of climate finance should also grow. Apart from mitigation and adaptation, developing countries have also said that climate finance should cover loss and damage due to climate change, which is an aspect that developed countries are a little hesitant to commit to. But how does climate change work and why is it such a hot topic of debate? This video will answer those questions. My name is Simran Sirur and you're watching Tipping Point. In 2009, during the 15th COP, it was decided that high-income developed countries would mobilize $100 billion by 2020 for developing nations to cope with climate change. This was done in the spirit of what is called common but differentiated responsibility, which recognizes different needs and abilities of different countries. This commitment was reaffirmed during the 21st COP in 2015 when the Paris Agreement was signed, and it was extended till 2025. But developed countries have had a poor track record when it comes to mobilizing this money. The money is tracked by a body of 38 developed countries called the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD for short. The OECD maps money that is transferred in four ways. 1. Bilaterally, which means from country to country. 2. Multilaterally or through international institutions. 3. Through export credits, which is when government financial support is given to foreign agencies. And lastly, through private investments that are mobilized by public finance. Data shows that till 2019, only 79 billion had been mobilized. This was just 2% up from 2018, indicating that the funds were growing at a much slower pace than they ought to have to reach 100 billion by 2020. In October, weeks before the COP26, these developed countries admitted that they would not be able to deliver the 100 billion before 2023, which is a whole 3 years after the original deadline. Both the OECD and the 100 billion goal have been criticized by developing countries for a number of reasons. One of these reasons has to do with the lack of transparency. A large proportion of the reported figures represent commitments and not actual dispersed flows. There are also concerns that these flows are not new or additional, meaning existing development finance has been reclassified as climate finance, and that accounts for a portion of the funds. Third, developing countries have said that the OECD is a far from neutral body, since it is made up of developed countries who are self-reporting their progress. There are problems when it comes to the funds and where they're flowing to. Most of the money is going into mitigation activities and not enough into adaptation activities. To be precise, 50.8% of funds in 2019 were for mitigation purposes, while only 20.1% were for adaptation projects. Adaptation activities like setting up early warning systems and building more resilient infrastructure are considered less profitable than mitigation activities like setting up solar plants, which is more technology heavy. Another big issue is that a larger proportion of the funds is being loaned to developing countries, sometimes at high interest rates. Only 19% of the amount mobilized in 2019 was in the form of grants. An anonymous negotiator wrote in The Guardian recently that loans at high rates were pushing poor and developing countries into debt. The distribution of funds has also benefited some developing countries more than others. Money flows to larger economies where investments can make profits, experts told the print. India, for example, has been among the bigger recipients of climate finance because wind and solar energy projects are regarded as commercially viable investments. So poorer countries that aren't considered commercially viable options are not only getting a smaller share of funds, they're also less likely to attract private investment. This is why experts say it's imperative for two things to happen. One, for the scale of climate finance to increase, and also for the proportion of grants as opposed to loans to increase. The last of the big criticisms of the $100 billion goal was that it was arrived at without any real scientific reasoning or clear understanding of how much mitigation and adaptation to climate change will actually cost. We know now that preventing and coping with climate change will cost trillions of dollars. In fact, a recent report by the UNFCCC Standing Committee on Finance said that developing countries would actually need between $5.8 and $5.9 trillion a year up to 2030 to meet less than half of their climate goals under the Paris Agreement. Developing nations have known this a while and have said at the COP26 negotiations that they will need much more than $100 billion in climate finance. They've also emphasized that developed countries ought to, at the very least, reach this goal as soon as possible. More significantly, negotiations are focused on what shape the new finance goal, called the New Collective Quantified Goal on Climate Finance, will look like. This goal will kick in post-2025 after the commitment period for the $100 billion lapses. The print had reported that developing countries were pushing to create a roadmap of this goal as soon as possible so that there are no delays in its implementation. But developed countries have resisted these attempts. India, along with the African group of countries, has asked for at least $1.3 trillion a year in climate finance, but countries like Australia, Norway, and the EU don't want to settle on a figure. There has also been a call by developing countries, particularly small island states, for loss and damage finance. Loss and damage happens when the effects of climate change are so catastrophic that countries simply cannot adapt to it. The logic behind this demand is that developed countries should pay for the climate change impacts being borne on countries that aren't responsible for global warming, but are extremely vulnerable to it nonetheless. A draft of the COP26's cover decision, which sets the tone for current and future negotiations, includes a section on loss and damage for the first time. It acknowledges that the need for loss and damage provisions will grow in the years to come, but developing countries and climate activists have said that more needs to be done. For The Print, this is Simran Siyur.